There are certain numbers in economics that make people sit up straight, whether they want to or not. And this year, $7,700 is one of those numbers. Why? Because $7,700 is how much the average American family will owe just for the interest on the national debt in 2026. This number is not the debt itself. This is not the $31 trillion of federal debt that the U.S. government is carrying. This is not the money the U.S. has borrowed from domestic and foreign lenders over decades. This is just the cost of servicing that debt. For every family in America, $7,700 will go toward interest payments, not the actual debt, just the interest. Now, think about it for a second. $7,700 is not a small amount. It's not just a footnote in the financial news. This is a number that impacts everything from consumer spending to tax policy to future growth potential. And the really concerning part, it's expected to keep growing year after year, which will result in a mounting burden that will be felt across generations. The U.S. government is projected to spend over $500 billion just to service the national debt in 2026. This number will keep climbing as the interest rates increase. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, predicts that interest payments will consume a larger share of the federal budget, creating a dangerous cycle of debt that may crowd out essential public investments like healthcare, infrastructure, education, and social security. And here's the critical issue. The federal government is expected to keep running annual deficits of over $1 trillion for the foreseeable future. This means that every year, the U.S. will be borrowing more money, which leads to more interest payments. The $7,700 per family just to service the interest will keep growing, and the U.S. government will be locked into this spiral unless serious changes are made to either tax policy or spending priorities. What does this $7,700 actually mean? Let's break this down. $7,700 is more than just a number. It represents the amount that U.S. families as a collective are contributing to the federal government's ability to meet its obligations without defaulting. This payment is not tied to new government spending, social programs, or anything that benefits the average citizen directly. This money is going toward the interest on existing debt. For comparison, consider that the average U.S. household income in 2026 is expected to be around $76,000. So, $7,700 is about 10% of the average American family's annual income. Think about that. Every year, the equivalent of 10% of a household's income is directed away from things like housing, education, healthcare, savings, or even leisure activities. And instead, it's funneled into the federal government's debt obligations. And this does not reduce the debt. It only keeps the machine running. The growing burden. Why it matters more than ever. The big question here is, why does this matter? This matters because the U.S. government's debt servicing costs are growing at an alarming rate. The interest payments alone are expected to rise sharply over the next decade, even if there are no major new fiscal policies put into place. The reason? Interest rates. After years of low interest rates, the Federal Reserve has already raised rates several times since the end of the pandemic. As rates go up, the cost of servicing the national debt rises along with it. According to the CBO, the government's interest payments will become the largest single expense in the federal budget by the end of the decade, overtaking spending on defense, Medicare, and Social Security. This growing burden on the federal budget means that the government will have to make difficult decisions about how to allocate its resources. More money for interest payments means less money for everything else, including critical services and programs that help the American people. And this is a key point. As the government spends more on interest, it becomes harder to fund programs that are important to everyday Americans. Whether it's healthcare, infrastructure, or education, these programs risk being underfunded in the long term if the government continues to devote more resources to paying interest on the national debt. The long-term outlook. Where does this leave us? If the U.S. continues to run $1 trillion plus deficits each year, the national debt will keep growing. This means that interest payments will keep increasing and the $7,700 per family could rise substantially. The CBO's long-term projections show that, unless something changes dramatically, interest payments could account for more than 20% of the federal budget by 2030. This means that, unless the government can get a handle on deficits and interest rates, we could see a future where interest payments crowd out other important spending categories, and families are left shouldering an even bigger burden. But what can be done about it? Possible solutions. Can the US tackle the debt crisis? Tax reform? One way to address the growing debt burden is by reforming the tax system. The US could implement policies that increase revenue, such as raising taxes on the wealthiest Americans or closing tax loopholes. This could bring in more money to reduce the deficit and help lower the need for borrowing. Spending cuts. While difficult politically, cutting government spending could help reduce the deficit and free up funds for other programs. However, this would require tough choices, particularly when it comes to entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security. Debt restructuring. In some scenarios, the government could look into restructuring its debt to ease the burden of high interest rates. This could involve extending the maturity of government bonds or even exploring options like debt forgiveness for certain programs. Boosting economic growth. Another potential solution is to focus on economic growth. If the US, Taiwan economy can grow at a faster rate, it will generate more revenue for the government without needing to raise taxes or cut spending. This, in turn, would help reduce the deficit and slow the rise in interest payments. What happens if we do nothing? If nothing changes, the consequences of this rising interest burden will only become more pronounced. More and more of the federal budget will go toward paying off interest, leaving less room for important investments in the future. Over time, this could affect everything from national security to education to social programs, and make it harder for the US to compete globally. Additionally, the increasing cost of interest could slow economic growth, as higher interest rates make it more expensive for businesses and consumers to borrow money. This could lead to lower investments, slower job creation, and weaker economic activity across the country. Conclusion. The $7,700 wake-up call, $7,700 is a wake-up call. It is a number that we should all pay attention to because it represents the future of US fiscal policy. If the government continues to run massive deficits, that number will keep growing and families will keep paying more. But there is still time to act. If policymakers focus on reducing deficits, reforming taxes, and controlling spending, they can ensure that future generations aren't burdened by the growing cost of interest on the national debt. But the clock is ticking. And if we don't act soon, the cost of $7,700 per family could be just the beginning.